Imagine a courtroom with a corpse as the star witness. A judge orders the suspect to touch the dead. The moment fingers graze cold skin, the wounds begin to freshly bleed. Gasps. A verdict forms. For centuries across the German lands, Scandinavia, and parts of England and Scotland, this was cruentation, the beer rite, where God was expected to expose a murderer through a bleeding cadaver. It stood beside oaths, ordeals, and inquests, shaping confessions, lynchings, and law. Manuals debated it. Preachers endorsed it. Crowds demanded it. By the end, you'll see how a ritual at the beer became proof in court. Ready to step closer? Start here. A low town hall, candles spitting, and a body laid out on a board sprinkled with salt and rosemary. The magistrate calls the accused forward. He hesitates. The crowd leans in. Touch. He does. A thin, dark thread creeps from the stitched gash and beads at the edge. People recoil, then surge closer. God has judged, someone whispers. Half prayer, half verdict. That scene isn't Gothic fiction. It's how communities from Saxony to Silesia, from Jutland to Norway, believed the truth would reveal itself. The dead would not bleed for the innocent. Only killers drew blood. Here's the real twist. This wasn't a random superstition hauled in by desperate villagers. It was a semi-formal rite, slotted into legal choreography that also used oath helpers, sworn neighbors, coroner's views, and in some regions, remnants of trial by ordeal. The beerside touch didn't replace testimony. It bent testimony, tilting everyone in the room toward one conclusion. And once the room tilted, everything else followed. Interrogation, confession, sentence. Imagine if modern juries watched a lie detector needle jump in real time, with a priest and a judge nodding along. That's the psychological gravity cruentation created. Next, we peel back the theology that made blood into speech. To medieval and early modern Christians, blood wasn't just fluid, it was moral ink. Scripture and sermons knitted justice to blood. Abel's blood cried from the ground. Martyr blood testified to truth. Christ's blood redeemed. Place that worldview in a courtroom, and a bleeding cadaver wasn't macabre. It was God signing the affidavit. Jurists and preachers framed the beer rite as the divine witness, a sacred intervention that cut through perjury. If the accused lied, the corpse would object, visibly, undeniably. But here's the edge that kept this belief alive. The ritual was perfectly ambiguous. If nothing happened, you could say God chose not to reveal. If blood welled, you could say God pointed. Either way, authority stayed intact. Clergy delivered funeral sermons using these episodes as moral thunderbolts, proof that God policed hidden crimes. Judges, anxious to calm frightened towns, found in cruentation a spectacle that reassured the public that justice had a supernatural backstop. And the crowd? The crowd needed a show. Still, whispers of doubt crept in early. Some theologians worried the devil could counterfeit signs. Physicians muttered about natural seepage in a body newly moved. Yet the rite survived because it didn't just answer a question. It turned uncertainty into theater. Next, how the law tried to cage the drama. Law books preferred neat lines. Reality bled through them. In the German lands, painstaking criminal codes pushed judges toward constellations of indications rather than single marvels. Manuals told magistrates to collect witness statements, weigh motives, inspect wounds, and, yes, sometimes stage a beer touch. The official line often hedged, "Cruentation might be a presumptive sign, never sole proof." On parchment, that sounded safe. In the chamber, it wasn't. Once 100 eyes watched a corpse ooze at the suspect's touch, the legal cautions shrank. The right lurched cases forward, enough to justify torture for confession in places where torture was permitted, enough to harden juries elsewhere. The doctrine said, "Don't convict on the bleeding alone." The practice said, "But it helps." Juristic debates flickered for 2 centuries. Some insisted God would not routinely overturn nature, so bleeding must reveal guilt. Others urged restraint. God's will is not coerced by judges' commands. And underneath the Latin footnotes, a practical need hummed. Terrified communities wanted verdicts that felt inevitable. Cruentation supplied that feeling. Let's leave the law bench and walk into a German town where a beer right performance bent an entire market square. Picture a Franconian market town in the 1590s. A carter's wife is found in a brook, skull split, pockets turned out. Rumors snarl the lanes by noon. A neighbor swears she saw the husband argue the night before. Another claims a stranger asked for directions at dusk. The council orders a viewing. In the Guildhall's cool shade, the woman lies on a plank. 3 candles gutter in sticky pools of fat. The husband, linen jaw shaking, swears innocence. A deacon murmurs the psalm about blood crying. Bring him to the bier. He touches her brow. Nothing. People shift, disappointed. The bailiff snaps. The wound. He takes her wrist. He brushes the split scalp. A thick tear of dark blood crawls, then 2 more chase it like twins down plaster. The hall inhales as one organism. Men cross themselves. Women whisper, "Murder." Somewhere the husband sobs, then vomits. Legally, the council still needs more. Practically, the town has already decided. The husband is clapped in the jail. Under questioning, sharp, relentless, he confesses a blow, a fall, the brook to hide shame. Did the blood force truth, or did the crowd? Either way, the beer right turned suspicion into certainty. Now, northward. How did Scandinavia use the corpse's voice? Across Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, echoes of the beer right linger in parish customs. Inquests could involve viewing the body with community witnesses, and sagas told casually of the dead knowing the hand that struck them. In rural parishes, pastors sometimes presided over touches at the church porch before burial. The language was spare, the meaning heavy. The dead and the living were one congregation. God could judge between them. In one Swedish parish chronicle from the 17th century, a farmhand denied killing a fellow laborer in a quarrel. The priest insisted he touch the corpse in the sacristy. Blood seeped at the wound. The farmhand was seized and later confessed after further proceedings. The chronicle presents this as both moral lesson and parish triumph. Hidden guilt smoked out not by clever men, but by a righteous God and a righteous dead. Notice the pattern. The right doesn't prove alone. It drags the case toward a confession or a corroborating witness who now feels safe to speak. It's less a test than a magnet for conscience and rumor. And when a test draws confessions, courts keep using it, even when codes hesitate. Next, the English and Scottish beer right, and a case that still chills. In medieval England, coroners' inquests already staged bodies in public. Neighbors swore what they'd seen. Jurors viewed the wounds. Here, Beer right never settled into statute, but it haunted the edges. Tales of corpses bleeding at a murderer's approach crop up in chronicles and church talk. The idea traveled well. It needed no law, just eyes. Scotland, though, gives us a thunderclap. In the late 17th century, a prominent gentleman was found dead, throat cut, water in his mouth to mimic drowning. His son, proud, insolent, and widely disliked, denied everything. During the formal viewing, he was compelled to touch the body. Witnesses swore the wounds gushed anew, soaking the shroud. Shock rippled through the gathering. The son was seized, tried, and condemned. His execution was staged as both justice and warning. For jurists afterward, the case became shorthand. The beer rite might not be law, but God could still appear. Was it post-mortem drainage? A slashed artery disturbed by moving the corpse? The son's own shaking hands? The jury didn't parse physiology. They watched theater. Today, we'd call it confirmation bias, supercharged by sacred spectacle. Now, swap the gallery's gaze for the pulpits. How did sermons make bleeding proof immortal? A beer that bleeds becomes a parable before sundown. Lutheran pastors in the German towns folded cruentation into funeral sermons. See how the Lord defends the innocent dead. Pamphleteers printed woodcuts of corpses rising in their shrouds, arm outstretched toward cowering killers. Cheap broadsheets raced ahead of courts, telling everyone the ending long before the trial began. Fear sells, fear teaches, fear convicts. That synergy mattered. A sermon could rehearse the theology, blood as testimony, God as witness, while also naming names and smoothing guilt into gospel. Townspeople left church with the story already settled in their heads. And once settled, they stood in the marks ready to hiss at suspects, to clamor at the jail door, to nod solemnly when judges reluctantly admitted a beer touch. The rite fed the sermon. The sermon fed the rite. Dark irony. These religious narratives meant to uplift justice also lubricated its worst excesses. A ritual that should have humbled courts before mystery hardened them into performance. And when performance replaces patience, restraint dies first. Which brings us to a smaller room, the interrogator's bench, where bleeding cadavers birthed confessions. Imagine you're the suspect who just touched your friend's body and watched it bleed. The room reacted. The scribe's quill skittered. A deacon's eyes brimmed with vindicated pity. You're led away. In an hour, a magistrate leans over the table. The Lord has revealed the truth. Tell it. Even without torture, that sentence is a tool. Confessions follow patterns. The guilty are crushed by exposure. The innocent are crushed by theater. Both understand the town already believes. So the guilty confess and seek mercy through God language. They accept the rod. The innocent confess because nothing else can stop the ritual from devouring them. Maybe if they perform guilt, they can at least control the last act. When torture is legal, the beer rite becomes the prelude that courts recite before tightening ropes. God has pointed. The instruments will confirm. Manuals warned against this slide. Reality greased it. The bleeding at the beer made pain seem like tidying, final paperwork after God stamped the file. But another set of eyes watched more clinically. Coroners and proto-forensic physicians began asking, what exactly makes a dead body bleed? Move the corpse and blood can pool and shift. Break fragile clots and dark liquid will weep from wounds. Warm a cold hall with bodies and candles. Pressure rises within cavities. Seams ooze. Handle the dead roughly. Stitch tension fails. None of that needs a murderer's touch. It needs time, gravity, friction, temperature, and human nerves. Early physicians noticed. Some wrote cautiously that natural causes may feign a sign. Others argued that if God uses nature, then physiology isn't contradiction, but instrument. A neat theological pirouette. But the more bodies physicians handled, the less persuasive the miracle felt. Post-mortem lividity, coagulation, purge fluid from mouth and nose. There were names and patterns. Bleeding turned out to be a stage of a process, not a divine verdict. Crucially, this knowledge didn't instantly erase the right. Knowing why the sky is blue doesn't make sunsets less hypnotic. In a courtroom, hypnosis is half the verdict, and telling grieving neighbors it's just gravity has never had the same authority as God has spoken. What finally weakened cruentation wasn't one article. It was competition from a new kind of spectacle, forensic proof. By the 17th and 18th centuries, printed autopsy reports began circulating. Coroners learned to describe wound tracks, scalp hemorrhages, water in lungs versus mouth, and the distinction between fall and blow. These observations built an alternative theater, less dramatic than a bleeding shroud, but terrifying in their own right. Dissected truths, not sacred signs. Judges found that juries could be mesmerized by a table of instruments just as strongly as by a bier. Wax models and anatomical drawings replaced woodcut miracles. The liver shows began to carry more weight than the wound bled. Where torture retreated and confessions lost their thrones, the post-mortem rose. But the bier rite didn't vanish overnight. In smaller towns, pastors held on. In frightened communities, the dead still knew the hand. And every time a corpse bled on cue, the old world inhaled again. Even as cruentation faded, its logic didn't die. We still hunt for shortcuts to certainty, rituals that feel like truth, which is why the bier rite's ghost haunts our modern tools. Swap the bier for a polygraph, bring in the suspect, wire them up. The ink spikes, the room inhales. Sound familiar? Polygraphs are not admissible in many courts for a reason. They're theater disguised as science, exquisitely sensitive to fear and context. But show that needle to a crowd, say, a jury trained by TV, and it can have the same gravitational pull as a bleeding shroud. Or take the CSI effect, juries demanding dramatic forensic fireworks and becoming disappointed with careful, boring facts. Old cruentation rewarded spectacle. So do we. We crave the moment the universe speaks and collapses uncertainty into a visible sign. That craving is human. It's also dangerous. The past warns us, when a sign overpowers process, justice tips. When a priest or a pathologist becomes a magician to satisfy a crowd, someone will hang for it. So the real inheritance of the bier rite isn't a dead ritual, it's a living appetite. But to understand the human damage cruentation caused, we need to leave law and step into the social world it shaped, especially for people with the least power. Bleeding proof fell hardest on those already weighted by rumor. Servants, strangers, widows who didn't cry correctly, husbands who drank, lovers who quarreled, travelers with no kin to swear for them. A ritual that pretended to be neutral became a lever for old hatreds and new politics. In some towns, a bier touch devolved into a lynch queue. In others, it became leverage in family feuds. Women suffered a particular cruelty. In cases of infanticide, where fear and poverty collided, young mothers could be hauled to the bier of a dead infant and forced to touch while the parish watched. If blood welled, shame followed. Even when courts later cautioned against conviction by sign alone, reputations were already gutted. Men, too, were ruined by the optics. A husband who didn't weep at the bier was cold. A husband who sobbed and triggered a bleed was guilty. The rite turned grief into accusation, then dressed that accusation in holiness. Communities bonded through it, yes. Nothing unites like a shared revelation, but they also blooded themselves with it. A society that exacts truth from corpses will learn to love what corpses give: a show. Now the endgame: how cruentation finally lost its license. By the late 18th century, a string of forces dimmed the bier rite. Clergy trained in natural philosophy grew wary of promising miracles on demand. Jurists codified evidentiary rules that prioritized corroboration, autopsies, and motive over marvel. Medical textbooks explained post-mortem bleeding with unsentimental clarity. Newspapers, which once thrilled to divine signs, pivoted to scandal-hungry but secular narratives. The divine witness lost retweets. Still, the ritual lingered in rural pockets and in literature and memory. Grandmothers told grandchildren never to pass a murder site without crossing themselves lest the ground call. Ballads remembered corpses that bled at the killer's step. The theater survived as folklore, even as courtrooms went fluorescent and clinical. And yet each time a sensational case grips us, each time a camera zooms on a single, decisive tell, the bier rite smiles from history. We keep staging certainty. We keep asking the world to perform guilt for us. Which brings us back to where we started. A corpse on a board. A finger extended. A crowd holding its breath. We think we're far away. The distance is only costumes. Woven through that spectacle were the strands that made it plausible. Theology sanctified blood as language. Sermons carried stories like wildfire. Jurists hedged in print and capitulated in practice. Crowds needed a show that felt like fate. The bleeding cadaver was never just a sign. It was a social machine. It aligned fear, faith, and authority so precisely that truth seemed to arrive, visible and wet. Once the room tilted, everything else rolled toward the same cliff. Interrogation hardened, neighbors emboldened, judges reluctantly persuaded. We traced how this rite created confessions less by miracle than by momentum. A suspect who had made the corpse bleed entered questioning already convicted in the eyes of the town. In places that permitted torture, cruentation functioned like a divine preface to pain, a justification for turning the screws on a story until it matched the sign. Even without torture, it corroded presumption of innocence by converting grief into accusation and wrapping it in holiness. We watched rival authorities, physicians, coroners, early forensic observers, edge into the room with quieter instruments. Wound tracks, lividity patterns, water in lungs, physics of a fall. Those tools began to displace miracles not because they were kinder, but because they formed a different theater. The new performance staged certainty with metal probes, Latin terms, and diagrams. Law shifted accordingly. The rite didn't die in a blaze. It thinned into folklore as codes and clinics thickened. But the deepest revelation here is not about past credulity. It's about present appetite. The beer rite thrived because it promised a shortcut to certainty, a drama where God would tip the scales in public. That appetite is alive in us. We dress it in machinery, polygraphs, predictive algorithms, sensational lab montages, but we still lean forward, hungry for a single visible tell that collapses complexity into guilt. The old ritual teaches a hard lesson. When a performance of truth takes the place of patient truth-finding, justice doesn't merely wobble, it flips. There's also a quieter lesson about grief. The beer rite let communities feel powerful in the face of violent death. It offered a script to act out anger and mourning, to transform helplessness into righteous participation. People left the hall convinced that they, with God, had pulled a murderer into the light. That's psychologically satisfying. It's also morally perilous. The urge to do something at the beer can become the urge to believe anything that lets us act. And then there is mercy. The doctrine on parchment often said, "Sign alone is not enough." A few judges and pastors tried to hold that line, insisting on corroboration, on slowness, on the dignity of the dead and the living. History whispers that they were right. The dignity of the dead is dishonored when we force them to perform for us. The dignity of the living is destroyed when we mistake a sign for a sentence. So what do we carry forward? First, a refusal to let spectacle, sacred or scientific, swallow process. Second, an awareness that every legal system has its cruentations, its ritualized shortcuts dressed as revelation. Third, gratitude for the slow, often boring craft of justice. Patient witnesses, careful autopsies, rules that protect the unpopular and control the powerful. And last, humility. The more certain a crowd becomes at the beer, the more dangerous the next step is. Imagine, for a final moment, standing again in that low chamber. The candles spit. The air smells of wax and iron. The magistrate says, "Touch." Now imagine having the strength to say, "Not yet." Bring the midwife, the neighbor, the surgeon, the man from the mill who saw the lantern lights. Bring the ledger with the debt. Bring the girl who heard the quarrel. Bring the path with the footprints in thawing frost. That refusal to let blood be the only word. That's the beginning of justice. If this dark journey shocked you, good. It should. Cruentation is not a curiosity. It's a mirror. We either learn from it, or we repeat it with better lighting. Which medieval horror still haunts our courts today? The bleeding shroud, or the desire to see one? If you want more uncompromising looks at the strangest corners of law, faith, and fear, subscribe. Share this with someone who thinks the past was quaint. And tell me below, would you have trusted the corpse's testimony